The Rebel Capitalist Show. Today, it's not really about Democrat, Republican, right, left, blue, red. It's really about, are you someone who believes in authoritarianism, or are you someone that believes in individualism? Because you
Right.
can have Joe Rogan and Brett Weinstein that are, maybe on the left. Brett's probably far left, but they value individualism. And then you got someone like Ben Shapiro, who is on the conservative right, and they might not agree on a lot of things. But the one thing they are in full agreement on is the value of individualism and how we need to stand up and really fight authoritarianism.
Right. So I guess if I wanted to define myself, then I would say I'd put myself in the anti-authoritarian camp, because authoritarianism, as I see it, you can get from going to either extreme of the political spectrum. You can get that in an extreme leftist government or an extreme right-wing government. Ultimately, the thing I tend to oppose is authoritarianism and government overreach, the state in general. Maybe it's anarchist. I don't really know.
Yeah.
People spend a lot of time getting caught up in labels, right? Which is why a lot of the stuff going on now, a lot of people, call it communist, other people call it fascist, and people are getting kind of lost in the weeds sometimes when it comes to these labels and vocabulary. But I think reducing it to sort of you're against authoritarianism is a little simpler for some people.
Yeah. What shaped your views?
Uh, well, are you asking about the recent crisis or in general?
Well, just
Um,
you're someone that is anti-authoritarian, authoritarian or authoritarianism. Was there something specific, like you heard about the Ron Paul movement as an example, or you read Road to Serfdom, or it's just a bunch of these little things that kind of you opened your eyes up to how the world really works, and you came to the conclusion that, hey, the individual should be the priority?
um, I don't think I can really boil it down to a very specific moment. I sort of, well, at least in terms of that aspect of it. Essentially, what happened for me is that I had two events that happened early on in my life. I'm pretty young by by some people's standards. I'm 32. But when I was about 11 is when September 11th happened. And I sort of had questions about that from a pretty young age, at least about, certain prevailing aspects of the official narrative. And then when I went to university to college, I realized that just like history classes didn't even really scratch the surface of anything relevant, uh,
Right.
you know. And so I started, looking into that and was kind of amazed that there were certain things that were just completely omitted that seemed really important. Because, if you go to school in the U.S. public education system, as I did, the history courses on U.S. history breeze over the 20th century. They spend so much time on the 1700s and 1800s for a reason, and arguably the most important events of recent history that inform our present are just totally glossed over. So the more you
Right.
start looking into that stuff, it becomes clear that you've been lied to about certain things. And then, what happened to me at that point is, well, how do things really work? And then you sort of realize who the powers that be are, what their aims are. And, it becomes kind of clear that they're to be opposed. So I guess you could say that was how I sort of came to hold those views in a sense, but it was, kind of a multi-year journey. I wouldn't really say it was like reading a particular book or a particular event, though it was 9/11 that set it off. But, I was pretty young, but I
Right.
did see that a lot of things had changed and things just didn't make sense. The Iraq War, all of that stuff. The Bush administration maybe was the seminal event, and Dick Cheney, people like that, and putting me on this path. I don't know. I still don't like them. I didn't like them then, so maybe that's something that's a continuity between then and now.
So let's start with the World Economic Forum. This is a group that I've kind of been focused on for quite some time. I don't think they're pulling all the strings. I think there's a lot of different variables. But how do you see them, and how much research have you done into what they do, and kind of maybe what their motives are?
Okay, so I would sort of group the World Economic Forum within a network of organizations that are sort of like the global think tanks, right?
Right,
So you
right.
have the World Economic Forum, you have the Council on Foreign Relations, you have Chatham House in the UK, and at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You have a couple of different of these organizations that write policy papers and essentially make policy in a sense. And in the case of the World Economic Forum, more often than not, that policy somehow trickles down to become policy of governments around the world.
Right.
So the question is,
And corporations.
how does this,
and corporations.
right? Of course. So how does this happen and whatnot? And what's important to look at, for example, in the case of the World Economic Forum, is really, who runs them. So their board of trustees. You have the head of the IMF. You have prominent central bankers there. You have heads of some of the biggest tech companies of Silicon Valley.
Right.
You have people like Larry Fink of BlackRock. Very powerful people at the very top. Of course, you have Klaus Schwab, who created it, the World Economic Forum, in the early 70s in close association with the Club of Rome, another one of sort of these global think tanks, the Club of Rome having longstanding ties to the Rockefeller family, and also their original paper that brought them to prominence, The Limits of Growth, is very much steeped in Malthusianism, and that was basically the topic. That was basically the topic of the World Economic Forum's first annual meeting that highlighted that paper.
And before we go any further, for the viewers who don't know what Malthusianism is, can you explain that? That's basically, there's not enough resources, so we probably got too many people.
Well, yeah, so it's essentially what the limits of growth argues is that, well, it's essentially what has been cemented as the prevailing climate change narrative today. But this was then back in the 70s, saying that, based on our calculations and models, I think they teamed up with some MIT guy or something, can't quite remember the specific details, but they had allegedly modeled this all out, that, there needed to be less people on the planet, or we were going to surpass the resource limit of nature and all of this. So actually that model was later proven wrong. And then the Club of Rome comes back in the 90s and talks about how this narrative needs to be continued anyway, despite the fact that their original model didn't actually hold up in the light of what actually transpired. Sort of like Al Gore saying, we're going to be all underwater by this year, and it didn't happen type prediction. So the Club of Rome was doing that well before Al Gore was. Al Gore, by the way, I think is also another trustee of the World Economic Forum. But you have a mix of central bankers, heads of corporations, former or former heads of state. So you have a mix sort of you have a mix of the public and private sector, essentially. And it's no surprise that the World Economic Forum labels itself as the global promoter of public-private partnerships, which is essentially where the public sector works with the private sector on equal levels. And so essentially what comes from this is that you don't really have the public sector driving policy the way that we've been led to believe for so long that they do, that, the government creates the policy and we elect the government. And so, there's this participation there of the public. Well, really the policy is coming from these types of individuals through these think tanks that act through these think tanks. And then that sort of trickles down to governments, who then sort of enforce that policy. And then there's the people that sell that policy to the public.
So the politicians are the useful idiots.
Well, I think more often than not, they're there to sell policies or make people think that they're the ones creating it when they're not. I recently had Ian Davis of In This Together on my podcast, and he laid out a really brilliant hierarchy for how all where the World Economic Forum fits into all of this stuff. He calls it the global public-private partnership. Well, at the top he has the Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of the central banks. Below that he has the central banks, and then he has the World Economic Forum and these other global think tanks. Below that he has, if I remember correctly, the policy distributors, which are groups like the IMF that say, okay, you want this aid package, you have to implement these policies. Those policies coming from the policymakers above. and then essentially being foisted on the governments that require the aid package. But you could also say that like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, fits in that category as well, because they say, oh yeah, well, you want this many millions or hundreds of thousands of dollars of grants, you have to research this and that, you have to promote these things if you want this funding, type of thing. So these same, billionaire philanthropists often sort of fit in this cycle as well. And the government through the state, are the enforcement power. They can legislate it, and and then it's seen by the public. But oftentimes it takes place well before that point.
That's a great description. And I think what it highlights is the amount of power that goes to the corporations or these global elites that are heavily influencing the corporation if they're able to control more of the share of the profits or the capital gains, and as far as stocks. And you just outlined it there, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But they always talk about stakeholder capitalism. I'm sure that's their buzzword, and they're always throwing Milton Friedman under the bus, right? We can't have this neoliberalism. We can't have shareholder capitalism. We got to have stakeholder capitalism. And it sounds great. Oh yes, these corporate entities should be doing good, for society, for our benefit. But what happens is when you really dig into it, you see, well, wait a minute, this just gives them power over more of the profits that the corporation is generating, and it's going into fewer and fewer hands. Therefore, if they control where those billions and billions of dollars, if not trillions globally go, then whoever's holding the purse strings, then they have the power, and they're taking that away from the shareholders and giving it to the CEOs or whomever is influencing those CEOs.
Right. So stakeholder capitalism is really important to focus in on, but they're also coming up, they've been using a new buzzword lately, inclusive capitalism, which is their new word for it. There's actually a council on inclusive capitalism that's headed by the Pope now, that has a lot of the same World Economic Forum leaders, or people that are involved with the World Economic Forum, and some other prominent members of the global elite, Lynn Forrester, de Rothschild, the Lauder family in the mix, the heads of Visa, MasterCard, the head of Salesforce, who's a very prominent member of the World Economic Forum, Mark Benioff.
He's like a disciple of Klaus. I always call him Klaus Mini-Me. He is. He's Mini-Me.
Yeah, he's a Klaus worshiper. It's worth mentioning, though, that Klaus's great mentor was Henry Kissinger. That's who got him in the game, apparently, if you believe him. You can look through his family history in an article on my website called Schwab Family Values on unlimitedhangout.com, and see about his father and the company he used to work for and all of that, if you're interested for some of the more background there. But anyway, when he went to, I guess, Harvard Business School, he was taught by Kissinger, who he later described as one of his main mentors, which is interesting. To say the very least, because Kissinger, I don't even really know where to start with that guy. Lots of decades of fuckery to talk about when it comes to him. But he's also involved in this effort to recreate the economic system as well, to an extent. Michael Bloomberg has created the New Economy Forum, I believe.
You're talking about stakeholder capitalism and why that's important.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, I was sort of talking about the different. I got off track talking about the different buzzwords, I guess, and different names they're calling for it. But essentially, there's this effort to create a new economic system that is stakeholder capitalism, but they're trying to rebrand it in different ways. Right. So they're calling it like inclusive capitalism, or like the new economy, the new, and all this stuff.